Good afternoon, and welcome to this concluding session to the 18th Annual Milken Institute Global Conference. It has been a heck of a run. I think it's appropriate. I had nothing to do with it, but it's appropriate that they were playing Mission Impossible music, because I didn't know that we could once again top what we did last year. But by God, I think our great staff has done it, and I hope you have had a wonderful time. We've explored. Thank you. We have explored 11 different tracks. We've added a special theme on women and girls. We added a special theme we haven't really talked about much, about celebrating and honoring our men and women in service through some special panels that we have, a new program we're going to be continuing. We have dealt with all of the problems of the world, but we've also dealt with all of the great hope and the solutions. It's been dizzying, and for those of you who have the stamina, and I hope you do, I hope you'll go online and watch some of the 100 or so panels that you missed, even though you may feel as if you have seen every panel we had to offer. It's been great, and I hope you will join us again next year, May 1st through 3rd, when the Global Conference will be back for our 19th Annual Global Conference. And please join us after the panel, don't go there yet, poolside for our reception. We'd love to have time to talk with you about the conference there. So now, with any further ado, let me turn this over to what is the perfect ending for this global conference, a wonderful tour of global prosperity led by our chair, Mike Milken, with a truly distinguished and wonderful panel. So welcome, Mike, and the panel.
Thank you, Mike. So, April 29th, 2015, 200 panels, 1 year of preparation, 700 panelists from approximately 60 countries, 4,000 people, presenting ideas, opportunities, many of which we will hold accountable over the last year and the next year and the years to come. Well, today we have 1 hour to broadcast to the world, and we've created this assembly of Milken Institute job creators, our special task force. And the assignment, which hopefully they will choose to accept, is to lay the groundwork. What has to be done to create 1 billion net new jobs over the next couple decades? How can we do this? What are the issues? Can we help people create meaningful jobs in the future? Luckily, on our panel today, we have 4 people on this task force who have volunteered for this assignment, generally by not rejecting it. We have representatives from Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America, significant knowledge on the Middle East and Latin America, and even, I'm sure, some knowledge on Antarctica. Each of them has spoken this year, 2015, on 1 or multiple panels. But this panel is not about regions of the world. It's about creating global prosperity. And so as we step back to think about that issue, obviously the first question is, what is prosperity? And many years ago, one of the wisest individuals that ever lived in the United States, Benjamin Franklin, drew really the first major American political cartoon. It was 1754. It was entitled Join or Die. And it depicted a snake cut into 13 pieces, each representing one of the states. And his message was to combine in order to survive. At the Global Conference, we have divided our efforts into 11 tracks plus a new one focused on women and girls. And our goal that many of you have seen has been to try to integrate these tracks. Those of you who focus on education, those of you that focus on energy and the environment, trying to get you to interact with one another. And so it was 50 years ago that I wrote down this formula at the University of California at Berkeley on prosperity. And what is prosperity? And the access to human capital brought by increasing it with social capital, real assets, and the need for the multiplier effect of financial capital. And so one of the things under this social capital element is obviously the rule of law, property rights, public health, universal education. But one of those areas is leadership. And President Kagame, who's been with us for a number of years, pointed out in Africa today, we recognize that trade and investment, not aid, are the pillars of development. And one of the great leaders of the African continent, Nelson Mandela, and in fact the world, told us real leaders must be ready to sacrifice all for the freedom of their people. And one of our panelists told us the art of leadership is saying no, not saying yes. It's very easy to say yes. So Tony, why don't you start us out? What did you mean by saying no? And two, what role do you see leadership playing in the next decade or two in the creation of jobs?
Thanks, Mike. What I meant by that is really this. If you look around the world today and think of the challenges that countries face and the role governments play in meeting them, often what governments should do is pretty clear. The problem is when they try and do it. And as anybody who's ever run a corporation or a community center or a football team, it's the same as running a country in this sense. It's about the art of change making. You know, in a world of change, you've got to be prepared to change yourselves. And so if you're a developing country, you've got to make changes in that country in order to access the opportunities. If we're in the developed world, we've got to reform the developed world systems in order to access the prosperity for the future. So that change making, though, is tough. And sometimes it requires leaders to say no as well as yes, and to give a clear direction. So one thing we need is effective governance, effective decision making. The second thing we need is for governments and political leaders to keep their countries engaged with the world and to keep their citizens open to the world. I mean, the thing I love about this conference is you get people from all sorts of different cultures and countries and faiths, and we cross the boundaries of the world. And the world works today by being connected. And the smart leaders know that they've got to keep their people connected to the world. But that open-minded approach to the world is often very rare. And the third thing, which is really what I said is that, you know, when you decide, you divide, okay? And when you step out rather than step back, and that's what leadership is about, stepping out, then it can be a little lonely out there from time to time. And the important thing is to realize that you can't govern by following the latest trend on Twitter. You can't govern by just working out whatever the prevailing wind is and following it. In the end, leadership is about trying to understand the world and the way it's changing, trying to make the right policy decisions in order to change your country for the better, and then sticking to it, right? Whether it's popular or it's unpopular, if you believe it to be right. And that's why the art of leadership, maybe it's putting a little negative to say it's saying no as well as yes. Most of all, what it is recognizing that your ultimate duty as a leader is to do what you think is right and hold to it.
Tony, you focused heavily on trying to strengthen government leadership, particularly in Africa and other places around the world. Does this create optimism in your mind? Are our leaders more sophisticated? Can we count on them in the creation of these jobs in the future?
I am optimistic about the future, and if you look back over the past decade or so, you see hundreds of millions of jobs. You see in places like Africa, many, many people lifted out of poverty and given opportunity for the first time. But I do think that for governments and politicians, they're subject to greater pressures than ever before. People expect them to deliver faster than ever before. Keeping pace with expectations is more difficult. And you have conventional media and social media multiplying to create quite a harsh environment within which political leaders take decisions. But the saving grace in the end is, I do actually think people prefer leadership to followership.
Now, Strive, when you ask the question, what is prosperity? What does prosperity mean to people? One of the answers we got back was, prosperity is a meaningful life, that people felt they have a meaningful life. And many years ago, I had a friend named Sir James Goldsmith, and he always used to say to me, Mike, I don't know if the person making $500,000 a year in New York City and sending his kids to private school has a better life or feels that he has a better life than a person working for him in Mexico, who might be making $5,000 a year, has housing provided, food provided, education provided in a very positive environment. What is a meaningful life? And so when we step back and think, say, about agriculture, and one of the keys in Africa and the future of Africa today, our experience in agriculture, for example, in the United States was most of the people in the United States lived on a farm in 1800. And one person fed one person. By 1900, only 40% of people or so lived on a farm. Most of them didn't live on a farm. And today, very few people in America, less than 2%, live on a farm. In terms of working, well, that one person in 1800 fed one. But by 1900, we had a situation where you fed more than one person per one. And by 2000, only 1.5 million Americans were really working on farms, and they were feeding 340 people. So as you think of the needs for job creation in Africa, and the great potential for the future of agriculture in Africa, how does this play into your thinking, and what can we do to be helpful with you to help create jobs?
Thank you, Mike. You know, when we look at the challenge we have in Africa today, first of all, our challenges are global challenges, because whatever we look at, whether you're looking at it from the United States or from Asia, we may frame things differently. But in the end, they're all global challenges. And the challenge we have in Africa is inclusive growth. The vast majority of our people are not seeing this 7% and 8% growth. We talk of the youth. 29% of our people really have stable jobs. So when we look at where could we get quick wins, well, 63% of the world's unutilized arable land is in Africa, at a time when we look that by the end of this century, half the young people of the world will come from Africa. So before we look at how we get growth, we really need to tackle the way in which we achieve food productivity in Africa. You were able to get these gains because you were increasing productivity. Whilst many parts of the world enjoyed a major agricultural transformation, Africa hasn't. And so one of the areas in which I have been very focused on is increasing food productivity in Africa, because much of Africa's food today is actually grown by women. So agriculture already employs more than 50% of Africa's population, and much of that is done by women. Over 60% of the food eaten in Africa is grown by women, and yet most of them have no access to land, they have no access to capital. So if we address this, that's one of the quickest wins to getting the numbers that we need for inclusive growth.
Now, as we saw in the United States, Strive, changes in agriculture actually reduced employment, not increased employment. So one of the points I think you're making here is by increasing productivity, we will probably free up more time for girls to go to school, get better education, etc. from that standpoint. But do you think the dramatic expansion in food production and productivity in agriculture over the next decade or so in Africa will net create jobs or net lose jobs?
I think in the short term, we could see a dramatic increase in job creation, if not necessarily in primary agriculture itself. Because when you talk of the reduction in the number of jobs of people in agriculture itself, they were moving into other areas. Those jobs were being created elsewhere. In Africa's case, we are not seeing jobs being moved into other sectors of the economy. So we're seeing this growth, but our young people are not getting jobs, and they are feeling increasingly alienated. And that has dramatic consequences for their nations and for the world at large.
Thank you, Strive. Now, Nuriel, we are putting a lot of pressure on you today, okay?
Yes.
Usually, you play the role of telling us everything that's wrong in the world, okay? But today, you not only have to first highlight the challenges, but present the solutions if we're going to create 1 billion net new jobs. Now, one of the areas you've spoken on tremendously is the change in technology. And if we look kind of at then and now and what's occurred here with technology, whether it was going to libraries or whether it was networks or all these changes that have occurred with the mobile phone activities, with even sending letters to now sending them digitally. And as we go through these and what's occurring, all of them, as you've pointed out, have the potential to eliminate jobs. And one of the things that struck me was I went to this music event and it sounded like an entire orchestra was playing. And at the end of the day, all a person had was his iPhone, which he had plugged in, which was now playing 14 different instruments at that time. And so when we start to think about it, how do we deal with the potential that technology is actually going to reduce jobs? How are you looking at that today?
It's a very important question, I would say. And before we figure out, of course, the solution to this problem, we have to understand the source of the problem. You asked how we can build or create 1 billion jobs in the next few decades. I think the first challenge is going to be how we prevent losing 1 billion jobs in the next few decades before we build them. And why do I say so?
Nuriel, I didn't want you to start us at the starting line. We don't mind getting backed up a little.
Let's set what are the challenges, and then I'll speak about the solution. The greatest living astrophysicist, Stephen Hawking, made the provocative argument a couple of months ago in a lecture that because of the developments of robotic automation, artificial intelligence, not only the robots are going to take over all jobs, but they're going to also take over the human race, and we should plan to go and colonize other planets. That's the idea of singularity. Now, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but I think what's happened for the last few decades is the following challenge. First in advanced economies and in emerging markets. You had trade and globalization, and therefore most of the labor-intensive, low-value added jobs in US, in Europe, in Japan moved to Asia, to China and other parts of Asia. First of all, manufacturing jobs, but now the same kind of information technologies are making services tradable. So take, for example, call centers. Now there are millions of jobs in Bangalore and Manila that are done there. So that's the first stage of trade and globalization that leads to offshoring of jobs. But tomorrow, because of technological development, both manufacturing jobs can be replaced by machines and robots. So the factory of the future could be 1,000 robots and 2 workers, one manning all those machines and the other one sweeping the floor. And by the way, the second one is going to be replaced soon by a Roomba robot, can do it faster and cheaper. And even in services now, once we're going to have a piece of software, Siri style, can do the job of the call center, and sometimes I call AT&T and it's not the human answering. Even those jobs that are in Bangalore, in Mumbai, and you name it, in Manila are going to be replaced by technology. So what's the nature of technology? It's great because we have massive technological innovation that makes lots of goods and services cheaper. However, technology is today capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving. Used to be a case that would save labor that were labor-intensive blue collars, but now even white-collar jobs that are low productivity, but also middle productivity, are gradually being replaced by software, by technology, by machines. That's the nature of the problem. Now, what's the solution? Of course, we have to provide education, skills, training, and make sure that every individual, whether it's in the US, Europe, Japan, and other parts of the world, is able to compete in this digital economy, but it's hard work. We have to invest into human capital, into physical capital, in infrastructure, in education. We don't do a very good job in many parts of the advanced economies. So I think that's the challenge and the solution to the problem.
Thank you, Nuriel. Now, as we start to think about Asia, 60% of the world's population, and Kathy, probably at some point 60% of the world's economy also, not there. Whereas Africa is the youngest part of the world, and Strive told us that at some point maybe half of the young people in the world might be in Africa, Asia's beginning to age, not just Japan, but China today. So as we look at the dramatic changes that have occurred in Asia, if we think about what did Orchard Road look like in Singapore before it was handed over to the Singaporeans from UK, it doesn't have any look today. So there's Orchard Road. We all wish we'd have bought some real estate at Orchard Road there. But as we all know, a leader came to Singapore, and it looks totally different today, and much of it can be traced to the leadership Tony talked about, which Lee Kuan Yew was focused on human capital and developing the skills not only of his own people, but recruiting the best and brightest. And when you looked at that comparison of Singapore and Jamaica, you saw the dramatic difference between this commitment to human capital that occurred since the 1960s to today in Singapore. But it isn't just Singapore. Kathy, when you're home in Tokyo, I don't know if you have pictures up on the wall of what Tokyo looked like after World War II, but obviously it also doesn't look anything like Tokyo looks today, or Seoul in the 1960s versus today, or Shanghai in 1987 versus today, and maybe even the most dramatic, in 25 years, Dubai versus today. And so physically, this part of the world has changed dramatically. The percentage of the world's economy has shifted there, and this unbelievable commitment to infrastructure that we've seen. So before you take us around the world and tell us what we need to do to create jobs, why don't we start in the most populous part of the world?
Okay. So I think if you scan, Asia is huge, and we have, as Michael said, some economies like where I live, Japan, neighboring China. Some people say China, the bears say China may grow old before it becomes rich. That population is aging extremely rapidly and is looking to countries like Japan to figure out what is the template, how are all of us in aging economies going to cope with a rapidly, silver or graying society. On the other hand, I just came back from India, India is now currently growing at a faster pace than China. We actually forecast it's going to continue this, outpacing China for the next couple of years at least. And I think a couple of points I'd make. One is on the aging side, because I've been covering Japan for 25 long and painful years. Everybody asks me, why should I invest in Japan? It's shrinking, it's aging. And I say, well, you should invest in it because Japanese people live a very long time and they got a heck of a lot of money. And they want to spend it, they want to enjoy life. I participated in a very interesting session yesterday where they talked about the opportunities in the silver economy. And people are saying, look, the model of education today in most of the world is what? We get educated from age 0 to 21, and we depend on that period to have produced the skills all of us need to survive until we're 80, 90, and not in the not too distant future, 100 years old. That's kind of silly if you think about it. It's a very arcane model of education and human capital training. Maybe we really need to rethink, reassess our resource allocation in the field of education, put a lot more emphasis on retooling, re-educating, retraining, starting a new career at age 50 or 60, because I think all of us will be soon living to, we're much in 90s and hundreds and not in the not too distant future. So I think that's a huge opportunity that the aging economies, the developed world can start to think about more seriously. And for the rest of the region, which is not aging, which is trying to deal with explosive population growth, remember the most number of people under the poverty line do actually live in Asia as well. And we forget about them, but there are vast numbers of them. And I think the key here, the silver bullet to me, is education, especially girls' education. We clearly, I think, can get rid of or deal with a lot of these global issues, including terrorism, by the way, in the region, if we can educate more girls and women.
Yeah, I think in the world right now we have this situation demographically wise. In many emerging markets, there is still significant increase in population, younger and younger people, while we're having aging in Japan, in Europe, even in the United States. And if you think about it, when you ask trade economists what are the benefits coming from international trade, today we have more trade in goods, more trade in services, more trade in technology, even more trade in capital, foreign direct investment, and so on. The one kind of asset that is restricted in terms of trade is migration. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, there are people that are in developing countries who have the same kind of IQ and skills as advanced economies, that the only reason why their per capita income is so low is because they don't benefit from the externalities of being in a society like ours, where you have high productivity. So the biggest benefit, actually, in terms of increasing job creation, increasing global welfare, will be to free labor mobility. After all, the United States was based on migrant coming wave after wave from Europe, from Asia, around the world. The problem is that in all advanced economies, right now, there is a backlash against migration. Certainly, historically, it's been this way in Japan, in Europe, because of high unemployment, there is the same thing, but even in the United States now, there's this big backlash. So if you ask an economist what's the most important thing you could do to increase global jobs and welfare and income, globally will be liberalized trade in labor, migration. That's politically the most difficult.
It is politically the most difficult, but here's what I mean by saying when politicians and leaders have got to have the courage to stand up and say what's actually going to work. Because you gave a great example of Singapore, but you could look at today, take the Korean Peninsula, South Korea, North Korea. It's one of the most extraordinary laboratory experiments in governance, if you like. You take Colombia and Venezuela today, right? Very similar types of country in the potential, very different in the outcome because of governance. And if we want to avoid a situation where, as Nouriel was saying, we have to go off and colonize another planet, and by the way, if we do, I want to be governor of Venus, but if we want to avoid that situation, then what we actually require is a combination of the right generation of ideas and government prepared to facilitate. See, when Lee Kuan Yew, and I often used to talk about this with him, when he actually started Singapore, people look at it now and say, well, there's this extraordinary development, this wonderful thing, and so on. But he had huge battles. One of the first battles was the insistence that people should speak English, right? because he knew that would connect his country to the world. And a lot of people opposed it, but he drove it through. And where you come to, particularly with some of the debates on immigration today and trade, there is no doubt at all that if we have enlarged trade, we have enlarged opportunity for people. And yes, of course, you have got to prepare people for these changes in the composition of the economy as a result of trade. But undoubtedly, the things that are being talked about now here in the US, the Trans-Pacific, transatlantic partnerships, they're fantastically important for the future. And the same is true with immigration. You look at my country, your country, as a result of those waves of immigration, you've brought in new creativity, new energy, new ideas. This is the world. So it's a combination of, exactly as we say, is the power of ideas allied, frankly, to the leadership necessary to say to people what the true answer to their problems is and not let them be diverted into anti-immigrant or petty nationalism or all the other cul-de-sacs. Anyway, that speaks as a guy who's out of office.
Well,
but I did say some of these things when I was in office.
well, Tony, I really appreciate you underlying the theme of this conference, which is the power of ideas. And I think one of the things we don't realize, there was a book not too long ago written by Matt Ridley called The Rational Optimist. And one of the things he told us and reminded us, for most of the people in the world, this is most of the people in the world, the last year was the best year they've ever had. As we're moving forward in India and China and other places of the world, Indonesia, they're moving forward. And he pointed out that poverty has been more reduced in the last 50 years than it had in the previous 500. And he compared a person today with a king of a few centuries ago. So I recommend you take a look at that. But he compared the life of royalty in England or Europe with the life of the middle class today and what services were provided then versus today.
Yeah.
With running water, sanitation, access to food, etc., telecommunications, etc. And even in India, we're talking 1 cent a minute to be able to communicate. And so when we think about all the challenges in the world, we also have to really step back and think that China is now capable, I would assume you would say, Kathy, of taking care of its own citizens. It doesn't need aid from others. And India is a long way towards moving down that track. Well, that's 40% of all the children and people in the world. So the growth of this middle class is changing. So Tony, you brought up an issue. Nuriel, you brought up an issue. We have, so far, I've written down and been keeping score. We have leadership, migration, trade, and infrastructure as 4 things.
Education.
And education. We're going to continue to add to this. So let's look. When we started the global conference 18 years ago, a series of CEOs, academics from around the world, government leaders, we said, okay, the purpose of the global conference is to bring people from diverse backgrounds together and ask them to solve problems. So they created a list. These are the 10 problems for the first half of the 21st century. So when we got this list, I think we challenged our Nobel Prize winners in year 2000, those in science, economics, etc. And they said there isn't 10, there's only 2, because in their opinion, they can solve all 10 of those if we're truly committed to energy and providing energy and infrastructure. We'll deal with the environment and food and water. And if we can educate people, we will deal with some of those other issues. Strive, as you think about the issues you'd like us to bring to the continent that's going to have the youngest population in the world, which it does today, to the sub-Saharan Africa, where life expectancy is almost doubled in 30 years, what are the inputs? We've led leadership, immigration, trade, education, and infrastructure. Are there any other things you want to see?
Well, you know, I've just
Or do you
been...
want to give us some details?
Yes, I've been listening to the Honorable Governor of planet Venus. And who does some extraordinary work in Africa, by the way, and we really appreciate. You know, I've just been involved with this pandemic, Ebola. And what that demonstrated to us is that, and I've said this on several occasions, a weak health system in Monrovia is a weak health system in Manhattan. It's a weak health because what looks like a local problem so quickly becomes a global problem. We have seen the dangers of pandemics. We've got to strengthen global health systems. We've got to strengthen our ability for surveillance. I also want to come back to the issue of leadership. For all of us, whether you're in business or you're in politics, we need to reimagine the way we lead. Our tools for leadership are inadequate for the global environment. We are trying to manage the world of the future with tools of the past. And this comes through even in how we respond to global challenges. A pandemic broke out in 3 small post-conflict African countries. And yet people said, it's an African problem. Others, it was a global problem. We have to respond to global challenges quickly, swiftly, with the right tools. So I would certainly add to that our ability, resilience to the challenges of global shocks as a major issue that we must be equipped to deal with. So it could be health, it could be climate. The issue is, have we created the tools that enable us to respond to these shocks? We always get shocked by shocks that we know are always there.
So I think, Strive, you've added number 6.
That's right.
And maybe number 7 here. One being health and wellness. And I think as Kathy pointed out, we've extended the length of life, but not only the length of life, the quality of life. And we all have a great deal to learn from Japan. The average person in Japan has 7 years longer of quality life before they engage a potentially life-threatening disease than people in the United States. And so it provides us a good education. But if we look at that extension of life, it has been the #1 driver of economic growth, improving both the length and the quality of life. And if we just step back and look at East Africa, we can see where this 50% growth comes from the enormous increase over the last 2 generations in life expectancy in East Asia. And we can see, as Strive just pointed out to us, by improving the quality of life and the length of life in dealing with health issues, just HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, in 20 years, a pregnant woman's risk of passing AIDS to her child dropped from 90 to 2%. And two-thirds of every single person living with AIDS in the world today, relatively normal lives, live in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a game changer. And then you've added environment, and we heard an Elmer Gantry speech from Governor Brown today on environment at the global conference. Nuriel, where else are we going to turn for job creation?
Well, I was very fascinated by that great panel you had yesterday at lunchtime about women development and business. I remember that of the 8 goals of the millennial goals that were set for 2015, 3 of them had to do, one with increasing gender equality and empowering women, secondly, reducing significantly child mortality, and the third one, increasing significant maternal health. There is significant interaction between the two. Having girls that have education, having girls that have health, that makes you more productive, you can work, you can have children that have the same health and education. And there is a huge amount of literature now in the development literature that shows that women's empowerment increases economic growth, and economic growth leads further to gender equality. Now, if we're thinking about the challenge in advanced economies of aging of population, take countries like Japan or Germany or Italy, where for a number of reasons that are not just cultural, but also lack of childcare that is cheap or lack of maternal leave, many women, after they get married, have children, they leave the labor force, and many of them leave for good. We can change it all. So if we have an issue of increasing labor force participation rate in advanced economies, and potential growth is going to increase if we have, in spite of aging, more people at work, then we have to increase the labor force participation rate of women, and there are specific policies having to do with making sure that women and children can work at the same time take care of their children. So that's something that I would certainly put among the list of things that needs to be done.
I absolutely endorse that. And if you look at what Prime Minister Abe, who is, I think, en route to LA as we speak, is doing, of course, he has QE and lots of other arrows flying. But one of the biggest arrows in his growth strategy is raising female participation. And we did a study years ago, just simple math. If you converge the female and male participation labor rates in Japan, you could add about 7.2 million jobs, lifting GDP in absolute terms almost 13%. Now, it's easier said than done, but the fact of life is there's more jobs available than people looking for work in Japan right now. So the demographics are really in a state of crisis. So I think, gender equity or more equal society is number one, and hopefully we don't have to have the gender session in future years. We don't need to talk about that. And second is using the older people. I don't want to say elderly people. I think a lot of people in Japan, they retire when they're 60, 65, even though longevity is in the mid-80s. They have a quarter of a century, most of them, in their lives to lead productively. And it's great to see graphs of, longevity has increased globally. It's great you're living longer lives, but if they're not meaningful lives, if you're just, as somebody said yesterday, you go on your Caribbean cruise and you send your kids off to college, what else is next? You want to hopefully live a life of fulfillment and
well, there
dignity.
is also a fiscal issue, because when Social Security was created in the United States in the 30s, the average worker would die 2 years before he or she would qualify for those benefits. Luckily, right now, we're living in the 80s, 90s, maybe even 100. But if we're going to retire at the age of 65, then funded liability both from Social Security and healthcare costs are going to become impossible. Mm-hmm. And now we're becoming healthier, we live longer. There is no reason why you should be retiring when 65. Definitely putting at work all these people is part of the solution. Otherwise, we'll have a fiscal disaster.
So let's take a look, if we could put up those United Nations millennial goals, those 8 goals that Nouriel just referred to, in that at the moment we've pretty much touched on most of them. We've dealt with the 3 in our discussion that Nouriel brought up and discussed: childhood mortality, maternal health, and gender equality. I think the leadership area in this global partnership has dealt somewhat with both the trade issues you've raised and the leadership area. The issue of extreme poverty and hunger maybe is also tied into the issue of education we've talked about, and we've touched based on health and HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, and we've touched based on the environment. But we brought up again, and I think Kathy has defined it for us, what is a meaningful life? And the challenge to all of us is not only to create jobs, but to create jobs or a life that is meaningful to people. And that's why when we think of prosperity, we think of a person having a life with meaning. And as Kathy pointed out, we are living longer, but the interesting thing is we are also healthier. So a 72-year-old man in the United States today is very similar from a health standpoint to a 55-year-old man in 1975. And so, Tony, these are our challenge. We have to meet the needs that Strive has given us for young people in this country, in this continent of Africa, where almost half the people are under 20 today. We have to provide opportunities for an aging population in not just Japan, but Europe, the United States, and China. And we have to provide opportunities in Latin America and stability of some kind in the Middle East today. So it's pretty easy to do that job on Venus. You know why? Because it's always easier to build than to rebuild. And so we have to deal with existing structures, existing beliefs, existing cultures, and things that have been handed down from generation to generation. So you've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. Let's take the optimistic path here, and it's a decade from now. How did we get to a period of growth and opportunity and stability in that part of the world?
By dealing with the root causes of the problem, which are a combination of bad politics mixing with an abuse of religion. And what you need to do is to build the institutions of government that are capable of governing sensibly and providing the right framework for advancement. And absolutely essential, you need to root out the ideology of extremism that teaches young people that those who are different from them are their enemy. And you need to replace it with a view of the world that is, as I say, open-minded. And this is the huge challenge across the Middle East. And it's the central challenge for their economy as well as their society. Because, by the way, in today's world, if you live in an intolerant society, you're unlikely to live in a successful economy. So these things are very much linked together. And I think for the Middle East, they're undergoing this huge and agonizing process of transition. There is hope, by the way, and I'll tell you what the hope is. A majority of people in the Middle East, like everywhere else, if they're given the opportunity, believe it or not, they would prefer to raise their families in peace and prosperity. They would prefer to know that if they work hard, they've got the chance of doing well, and they would prefer to have a government underneath them, not on top of them. So, you know, this is what we've got to work with in the Middle East today and hope that we succeed. And that's going to require a big effort inside and a big effort outside as well. And one other thing I would like just to add to your list, because this is, you know, you talked about legacy systems. You know, I think one of the most difficult things today is to innovate. If you're going to innovate, you need access to the best ideas. And I think the application of science and technology in resolving some of our problems, we actually talked earlier about how it might give us some problems, but when I think of healthcare systems or education systems today in the developing world, and sometimes presidents or prime ministers say to me, how do we get a system like yours? What I want to say is, don't try to get a system like ours. Learn from our mistakes and move ahead of us using the technology that's available today. That's a bit of a segue out of the Middle East, but because once you told me that 18 years ago you listed all those things, I want to make sure in 18 years' time, since I'm now going to be living longer, that we show up with the right list of things.
Well, I think the issue you brought up here on education, a revolution is going on in education. And we're never going to build as many schoolrooms in India, etc. And it's quite possible our smartphones will bring it to us in Africa. Strive, let's go to you. We want the world a decade from now, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, if not all Africa, to have created hundreds of millions of potential jobs for people to feel they have meaningful life. What should we take away, all the people watching this panel around the world and here today? What can they do to help that mission that I know you're so focused on?
We have, in sub-Saharan Africa, we are bringing 11 million new young people to the job market. And yet we are creating just over 1 million jobs a year.
Every year.
It's a terrible cocktail. For us sitting in this room, for me, it's education. But with that education, we have to focus on skills, because we have to close the gap between education and the requirement for skills. For us, we have to push as hard as we can, skilling up these young people and creating opportunities for them in an inclusive way. We have to build infrastructure, because infrastructure gives us a quick win to creating jobs. We have to invest heavily in things like broadband, because it's one area where we will see tremendous amount of new jobs being created in Africa. It's a new technology, yes, but you will see jobs being created if we invest in skills, if we invest in areas like broadband technology.
So, Kathy, we can talk about job creation in America driving the world's economy. But as we step back, at some point here, at least 4 of the countries in Asia will ultimately be 4 of the 6 largest economies in the world: Indonesia, China, India, and Japan. What, as a group, could we do? What could we see, and what could possibly happen here to drive growth in Asia, since that's where most of the people in the world live, and we want to provide meaningful jobs for them? And as we all know, there's hundreds of millions of people living in India and hundreds of millions in China today that have really not entered the 21st century yet today.
I think a couple of things. Obviously, many of the economies that have so-called prospered and developed in a fairly rapid pace over the last few decades, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, they benefited because somebody was willing to buy their products that they exported. So continuing the sort of mission to keep trade as open and global as possible, I think, is step number 1. Step number 2 is you have to also be a responsible partner. And I think that speaking to a lot of leaders in the region, it's very clear it's sort of a dog-eat-dog world, and I'm going to invest there first, grab those resources here, there. But what about giving back? What about the sustainability question is not always answered in these investment decisions. And I think that maybe all of us, not just in Asia, but globally, we need to hold the feet of our leaders to the fire on the question of, well, are you just taking and not giving back in order to make this cycle a virtuous one rather than a temporary one that we often see?
So, Nerio, you're a great observer of the world. Mm-hmm. You travel the world, you interpret it for us. We're going to give you kind of the last word before I wrap up here. We're looking at job creation. You've given us a list. Is there anything else? We have a number of the world's largest investors here, a number of leaders in government here, a number of leaders of universities here. What can we do to help the world grow and create meaningful jobs?
Well, we covered many topics, but I will make the following maybe additional observation. If you think around the world, there are some countries that are endowed with a huge amount of natural resources, but they've been suffering of what people refer to as the resource curse. When you have too much natural resources, you become lazy. It's a rent-seeking society. I mean, look what's happening in places like Venezuela or Argentina or even in Russia. And compare that one with countries that had almost no natural resources and had to import all of them. They used to be very poor countries, some of them in Asia. An example is Japan, another one is Korea, another one is Hong Kong, Singapore, and the other one in other parts of the world is Israel. And they've become, from very poor countries in the last 50 years, some of the most advanced economies in the world. What's the difference? I think they all invested first and foremost in education and human capital. They invested into physical capital. They invested in innovation. So those are the key things, first of all. Secondly, going back to the theme of migration, not all of them, but some of them, like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Israel, have been blessed by allowing a significant amount of migration of people from other countries that enrich them in terms of human capital and skills. And if you think about other parts of the world, even countries that are endowed with natural resources, those that have done best, because the US has a lot of natural resources, Canada, Australia, have been also countries that have been open to immigration and bringing the best and using their natural resources together with investment in human capital to make a great society. So I would say trade, globalization, infrastructure, human capital, investments, and also openness to migration and to ideas and to people are some of the characters that make an economy successful.
Thank you, and I want to thank our panelists. I have a list of 10 if you want to write it down, and you can figure out what role you want to play. Leadership, migration, trade, infrastructure, education, lifelong learning, medical research, public health, environment, a focus on children, science, technology, and innovation being number 9, and number 10, an open mind, willing to accept diversity, tolerance in the culture, and Tony didn't take us there, but maybe the lessons of Northern Europe, a separation of church and state. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing which of those 10 you want to pick on for your little project when we send you an email. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank our panel for coming today.
And thank you, Mike. And thank you all. We'll see you at poolside for the reception. Thank you.